And we finally have made it to the Enneads Part 4. Today we're going to discuss sections 4.1 and 4.2, which go together. They're both on the substantiality of the soul. This section, the first, it's broken up into two sections, but they seem to go together, even though they were originally in different parts of the book. The translator and editor of the version that we've all been using does get into this a little bit. He discusses that his decision in one section was to keep section 1 where Porphyry had it, and the one we're going to talk about in a minute, but probably together. He went with what Ficino's order was. It seems that the section that we're about to read actually was kind of an epilogue to a discourse that happened earlier in the book in the original order of things, but actually in the reading that we're doing hasn't even occurred yet. So I thought that was a little strange. Not quite sure why he's put it here, but here it is. The main point, I think, of this, as he also says, is that, or as he believes, is that Plotinus was addressing this section, this paragraph in the Timaeus that I guess was seen as a little apocryphal, a little difficult to understand. And I think that Plotinus has come to some conclusion on it. So I wanted to start by just reading briefly the section in the Timaeus. I have a version called from, I don't know, the 60s or 70s, the Cornford edition. I don't know if you can see that. It's not focusing. Okay. So the section in question is section 35A 1 through 3. And this is the section that starts with, that is called, this whole section is called Composition of the World Soul. And 1 through 3 is basically the entire paragraph. And it states, the things of which he composed soul and the manner of its composition were as follows. Between the indivisible existence that is ever in the same state and the divisible existence that becomes in bodies, he compounded a third form of existence composed of both. Again, in the case of sameness and in that of difference, he also, on the same principle, made a compound intermediate between that kind of them which is indivisible and that kind of them which is divisible in bodies. Then, taking the three, he blended them all into a unity, forcing the nature of difference, hard as it is to mingle, into the union with the sameness, and mixing them together with existence. So it seems he's talking about a demiurge or a god creating the world soul, but Plotinus seems to think that the matter of the soul that we are is identical, I suppose, with the world soul, or is part of it. And clearly this talk of difference and sameness and how he can reconcile the idea that the soul is both divisible and indivisible was the topic that he wanted to wrestle with. So he first starts off kind of stating a lot of, just off the bat, again, restating, these are things the soul is not. It's not a body. It's not of harmony of incorporeals, which I think he means it's not an amalgamation of other incorporeal things. And he says it's not a realization of potential or a vital principle. So I'm assuming he means it's not like the expressed principle that then animates. I think that's my interpretation. And then he goes in by saying the soul is in the intelligible world, and that it is between divisibleness of the sensible world and the indivisibleness of being. And that's then what he starts explaining there. Jeff, do you want to get into a little bit what he means by the two aspects of indivisible and divisible and why they apply? Yeah, or rather how they apply to those two different realms, I guess, and how the soul has both of these aspects, I guess, in humans, for example.
Well, to quote him, he says, intellect is always without separation and is indivisible, and the soul in the intelligible world is without separation and undivided. But he points out that the soul has a propensity to be divided, although that division does not happen at the realm of the forms or the intelligible realm. But instead, once the soul is expressed further, then it has this result of being divided. And so when we talk about the soul being divided among bodies, what it's talking about is in the natural world, in the physical realm, the soul is divided, but at the intelligible realm, it's undivided. So it is one and many. It's not exclusively unified or indivisible in all aspects, but at the same time too, it's not divided in all aspects either. There's a dual nature to this, depending on the level of reality that we're discussing. And so what this means is that we have to look at the soul in primarily two different aspects. One is the undivided and the other is the divided. And so some might argue that there's a contradiction there, but I don't really think there is, because throughout the whole book so far, he's always been saying that at the intelligible realm, everything is undivided, whereas in the natural world, the material world, things are inevitably divided. So why would the soul at the level of matter or its engagement with matter have to be undivided? And it also comes up with the resulting problems that would arise if we were to propose that the soul is undivided, that the material realm also are many. So yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. It's
Right.
just explaining this one passage in Timaeus about the nature of the soul, the quality of the soul.
Right. I think he also goes further and kind of qualifies what he means by the kind of divisibility that the soul has versus the kind of divisibility that regular material things or bodies have. I think he explains, like, as an example, that regular material things, when they're divided, say a banal example, if you took me and you divided my body, my arm is not the same as the rest of my, if we cut my arm off, it's not the same as the rest of my body. Whereas the division of the soul, even though it's dividing in the sense, it's my understanding, and I may be wrong, is almost like as if it's not replicating, but it's almost as if it was replicating, in that it's divided, imbued in all these separate material sentient beings, right? Or beings that are alive and then sentient because of the soul. But that soul remains whole, almost, and not quite the same, because I'm not saying it's the same as the example I'm going to make, but just for the purpose of like trying to visualize it, it made me think of like cellular division. When you have a cellular division where the actual RNA or DNA of the cells are still identical and they divide, but in every other aspect, they are still both whole and identical. It's not like one cell has one aspect now. It's not like it actually, like cutting a piece of meat in half. It's, cleaving and becoming two separate things that are still whole and identical. So that was kind of the visualization I used to imagine how they can be divided, because they're going into all these, or they're imbuing all of these bodies with, with consciousness. So they're divided in that sense, but they're not truly divided in this other sense that he means. They're still whole. The entirety of the soul that is in me is the same as the soul that is in you. That is the same as the soul that is in, I guess, everybody. That was my understanding of how he kind of reconciled these two concepts. Did you have a similar understanding, or was there something more that you saw in this?
I see it through the analogy of light going through a prism, where it starts with white light, which is unified and together. And then when it goes to the prism, you get the spectrum of colors. Ultimately, the spectrum of colors originates from one unified, visibly solid beam of light. But then when you have its division, then you see the spectrum of colors coming out the other side. And so we beings walking around the material world are the spectrum of colors that have originated from a single beam of light. And if you just trace it back to its origin, then all the different lights, all the different colored lights originate from that one beam of light.
Right, because the beam of light, even though it's, I guess, divided or fragmented, it's still the same light. It's not like separate lights with separate qualities in actuality. I had a different thought that occurred to me, but I like yours better, because I had thought of a lot of beakers with different paint in it of different colors, and then pouring from the same pot water in all of them, and they'll be different colors, but it's the same water. But yours makes using light as the example, I think, is a better analogy, where it's fragmented, but really it's the same light and just manifesting differently. And I guess, like we talked about in last episode, us being the spectrum of light, and the differentiation is just how the material, I guess, metabolizes, or what's the word I'm looking for? How we filter the experience in this realm of being conscious.
Mhm.
But the consciousness is the same stuff throughout. And then he says, I think at the end, just like at our level, the soul is many, there are many souls, indivisible. Even at the higher level of the intelligible realm, there are many aspects, but it's all whole. There's like not,
Mhm.
there's different aspects of the intelligible realm, but it's all one thing.
Indivisible. It
Yes,
has,
indivisible.
out of necessity, it has to be
Yeah, the
indivisible.
soul is one in many, he says.
Right. Well, because reasoning occurs outside of the body, and our cognition of the forms occurs outside of the body, that means also that although our normal, mortal, limited perceptions are rather small, nevertheless, we're all basically part of the same network of reasoning. I think by implication, it would mean that if you and I are reasoning in the same way, that's actually happening at a higher, unified, coherent, indivisible level. My point is that when both of us cognize the same form or series of forms, there's a sort of unity and indivisibility to that. But then when we have to express ourselves through language in the physical world, then we use different words and different ideas to express to one another what we have cognized. But the actual cognition of the form, assuming that we're cognizing the same thing, is in fact identical. The experience is even identical.
So like the human, are you talking about when it's embodied, like us as individuals?
I'm saying that so you and I, when we're cognizing the same form, that's occurring at the level of the intellect, not at
But
the level of the
discursively.
body. Discursively, yes. But
So
that's
basically like the human condition, even though often it manifests or it is expressed in different ways. I mean, I guess you could say that the human condition is a result of what you're describing. At least, does that make sense? Because you're saying at some level we are all maybe not necessarily, but often we are all cognizing the same thing, but the way that we then express it within the parameters of our physical existence and the language and the culture can come across with some particular differences, even though there may be some similarities. It's not identical, even though at a higher level.
That's true. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. But also, what I'm trying to emphasize is that so when you and I cognize the same form, that's actually happening outside of our respective bodies and identities.
Got it.
And technically, we are the same. We are
Yeah.
the same world soul cognizing the same form
Got it. Yeah.
simultaneously. And then when we have to communicate with each other back here in the material world, then we have to use language and our own ideas to articulate what we just
And
cognized.
the big barrier of understanding, communication.
Right. And
As
because,
we understand it, as we are capable of it anyways.
right. So it's interesting to think how there is this active, unified or divided versus undivided aspect to our experience, but simultaneously, even when we're engaged in discussion, our cognitions are happening at the level of the soul, of the higher soul. And if we're cognizing the same thing, then just for those fragmentary moments, we are actually one and the same. But then when we have to start thinking about it more and then articulating it using language and physical gestures and so forth,
And
or
even the personal, and it's also coming through the physical filter of the person, which is all of their experiences, their psychology, everything else, right? The idea that that he's already presented many times before, that he thinks everyone is actually oriented toward the good and trying to do the good. So on some higher level, we're actually all cognizing the good. For example, if two people have, we're actually thinking what once we discuss it, we might think we're having two different ideas. Say we are having a political discussion on something and we don't see eye to eye. We're on different sides of the political spectrum or whatever. But maybe on that topic, on a higher level, we're actually cognizing the same thing, but one's filtered back down through us, not only at the level of communication and language, but culture, every aspect of your physiological, psychological, and molecular human body. You've experienced things differently and come to it from a different point of view. So it may filter out sounding and being, or with the appearance of a very different base idea than the other person, but at the higher realm, it was actually a contemplation of the same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And at that higher level, there is no
Division.
divided identity.
Right.
So
Or experience, because
which means that in one aspect, our identities are undivided. Our, how do you say? Our
Well, we don't have an
personhood.
identity, I would say, at a higher level, because I feel
That's
like
that's what I mean. Where they overlap, they are indivisible, undivided.
I feel like identity only exists because we live in time, in linear time, because identity is only both something caused, I guess, due to spatial things such as our actual physiological, molecular, and DNA makeup. And the other part is our experiences, and experiences can only be had in linear time through events.
It's also the serialization of experience is different for everybody.
We can't, because I guess that's my point. You can't really have an experience outside of time. I don't think you can. You're not experiencing anything because nothing's happening in the sense that we think of things happening, because there's no motion, there's no event, going back to the chapter on time and eternity. So the whole nature of the reality that we can even conceive really only exists, and the way we function can only exist in the linear reality that we live in. Something else he brings up at the end of the book, or it's not at the end of the book, at the end of the section, or kind of is when he's arguing against the Stoic position of them thinking there's some primary part of the soul versus him saying it's whole and it's imbued throughout your entire body. I thought that was an interesting, maybe ancient way of, or at least I saw a correlation between what he was saying and the reality of how cognition and neurology works in our body. And it's true. It's not like we have separate brains, for example, or separate consciousnesses. If I have pain in my hand, yes, I feel the pain localized in my hand, but the awareness of that pain is pretty much almost instantaneous and coming from and experienced throughout. It's not like this part of my body has a different identity or soul that is having a separate experience than my hand, right? So I thought that was insightful of him. I don't know if that was his intent, but I think he was also in his own way, without maybe the kind of empirical research we've done now on the nature of, sensory experience and how the brain communicates with the rest of the body. He was, though, observing the reality of being a person. Like when you feel something emotionally or physiologically, it's not like you're feeling it just in one spot and then it does not appear to have to be communicated. I mean, it does, in reality, it does get communicated down. So I don't know if the Stoics are 100% wrong either, but I thought it was an interesting way for these two ancient schools to be making logical observations on things that we now have come to similar conclusions using other methodologies.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a lot of insight that these ancient thinkers had that I think are still applicable to the sciences that we have today. I mean, this leads to the question of, where is the soul in modern science? But I mean, that's a whole other story to delve into, that the soul was abolished from scientific investigation many years ago.
So it may be returning in the form of the concept of of consciousness, which, depending on how you define what consciousness is, it is not necessarily different than the concept of soul, especially as I'm not saying, I mean, the word consciousness is a loaded term anyways. People are defined, there's like a general term for it, but in reality, it's the very nature and definition of this term is something that's contested. But there are schools of thought that would equate our consciousness, I being one of them. I think when I think of consciousness, as we are thinking about it, leaning forward with people who are not afraid to really delve further and further, and in scientific research and and I guess theories, because we don't know what we don't know.
Hmm.
But that, and what this guy is talking about when he talks about the embodied soul, which is the ability, is the intellect, is the ability to cognize things and run this body and the self, that as it manifests when we're alive. I don't see a whole lot of difference between that kind of definition of consciousness and the definition of Plotinus's embodied soul.
Hmm. Well, you're right. I mean, in the modern day discussions on theory of mind, there's not a unanimous decision or not a unanimous opinion on what exactly mind is.
All right.
And I mean, even within uh, materialism, nobody's been able to find consciousness or
Because
mind.
it's not something they can quantifiably, they can see, I guess, peripheral evidence of it, but not direct.
Well, the point is that nobody's been able to find consciousness or the mind. What they see
Yeah, it's
is
not.
neural activity, but
Yes,
neural activity is still not
right. It's just
mind.
evidence that something's happening, but it's not like, it's like symptomatic of perhaps of consciousness, but it's not consciousness. It's the same as, say, if you are trying to diagnose an illness, you may see the symptom, like someone having a fever, but the fever is only symptomatic of whatever the heck you have. And if you can't find it, and if you, not that I'm saying consciousness is an illness, even though some people might think it is,
Hmm.
but it's, if it's something that isn't measurable and is immaterial, at least as we conceive of material, then they're never going to find it. Not using the tools they're trying to use.
Well, in science, there's a position called emergentism that suggests that consciousness arises after a certain point when matter is configured in a specific way, in a certain serialization. So what you have to have is, for example, a biological organism with a brain and a number of other variables, such as, oxygen and so forth. And only
But you
then,
still can't indicate where it is.
so this is the point where they can't pinpoint exactly where and at what point it emerges. But the alternative is to basically reduce the process down to atoms and matter, and in which case then you end up with panpsychism, where you can't actually find at what point sentience, awareness, consciousness arises. So what you might end up doing is concluding that all matter is inherently aware to varying
I guess
degrees.
it goes back to what's consciousness. Like, what are we defining as consciousness? Because is sentience and consciousness the same thing
I mean, that's a good question.
necessarily?
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, in my opinion, you can have a sentient stream of awareness without all those emotions and thoughts, conceptions,
Well, what is
images.
sentient? Like, I'm not defining it, but like at a first thought, I could say me and my cat are both sentient, but maybe rocks are also conscious, but not sentient. Or like, what about trees? In some ways, they're sentient. They have sense perception of different ways. They're in some manner analyzing and using this information and even act together in groups. Is that consciousness? What is consciousness? Do you need a brain as seen in the animal family? Or can it exist, or can you have consciousness that uses different organic bodies that is not what we think of as the brain? Or what classically is what the brain is for animals?
Right. So we come
The
to all of
plants and
these different
fungi have
questions.
brains. They're just not
Right.
brains like the thing in my head and your head.
Hmm. Right. Right. So the
But
point
yes,
is,
it's definitely a matter of great debate still. And me personally, I don't think it's a matter that will be found through empiricism unless they're 100% right. But I don't
well, if
know.
we can
I don't know.
if we can figure out a way to transfer consciousness from one brain to another.
I don't think you can do that unless you know what consciousness is first.
Right. If they could manage to transfer consciousness from one brain to another or one body to another, then I guess you could demonstrate that consciousness is somehow directly a part of the material process, an emergent process from it stored in one brain, so you could transfer it like data.
Well, that would be instantaneously understanding what, like figuring out what consciousness is. You can't do that unless you really know what consciousness is.
Yes, and so far nobody's been able to
No,
undeniably determine this.
they
So
haven't been able to really undeniably understand a lot of things. They like really at the end of the day, what is actually verifiable is very rudimentary. If we look at it from the more with the expectation of some whole understanding of the true nature of why we are conscious, or what we call consciousness, that we are aware and think and believe to be here.
right.
So there is another section. Do you want to talk about it? In 4.2.1, he talks about true substantiality as being the intelligible cosmos.
Right. So
Yeah.
right. So this is the very brief part,
Right.
4.2, on the substantia of the soul 2. Right. Yeah, this is where he's saying that the intellect is indivisible. The soul at that level is indivisible, and then has propensity to divide, but only after its departure from the intelligible realm.
Well, that
And then he said,
that an intelligible realm, it's whole.
right, indivisible
Yes.
at that level.
And souls are as well. I mean, yes, we're talking about souls. Yes, that souls are indivisible at the intelligible realm. And that there's also souls in the intelligible realm that are not associated with bodies, which I guess is the realm in which, if we entertain the idea of spirits or daemons or gods, they would be in the intelligible realm as just souls that are disembodied. Therefore, even if they are particulars, they're still at the same time indivisible if they only exist in the intelligible realm.
Right. It means that they're not subject to descent into a material form.
Right, but they also don't exist as divisible things as we comprehend it here, like me and you being two separate entities. Even if they may manifest, or we can think about them as different aspects, it's all undivided, though, really.
Right. I mean, I think
to understand, but
I think it's hard to understand. I mean, if you're saying souls plural in the intelligible realm, it means that there's more than one.
but
So
that's what he says too. He says the souls are undivisible at the
yes,
intelligible realm, and some of them never even have a body that they associate with.
right. I mean, and what that means is that there is still a separation of intelligences, but they are also undivided
Right.
at the intelligible realm. And so there are gods also operating at that level. And then they are expressed as different entities with different creative influences and powers in the material world, or at least the product of their the product or the outcome of their decisions and thinking. Going back to the earlier chapter where the world that we experience is thought into existence by the divine. So
It's kind of an inverse cosm of what we are, where there are aspects, or in some way there are particular differences, but they're all unified or indivisible. Whereas here, there is more, apparently, a bunch of division, but actually it's all unified also.
depending on the way you look at it, yeah.
Yes.
There's two aspects to it, the divided and the undivided. I think for ordinary people, it's very hard to conceptualize what undivided existence as a soul would be like.
I don't think we can usually, because if we could, we would be that. It's beyond our comprehension. I think we can kind of think around it, try to create examples that stand in the place of understanding it, I think, but I don't think we can truly comprehend it.
Yeah. But maybe that's the challenge too, is
Right.
that the more we direct ourselves towards the
Sure.
intelligible realm.
Doesn't mean we shouldn't think about it.
Right.
I mean,
And
people didn't know a lot of stuff until they did a big think about it, right? Things that were incomprehensible at one point.
mhm,
But these two chapters are, I mean, he is saying something. It's mostly just going into his cosmology, really, these two chapters, and kind of his idea of how things are structured.
right.
His metaphysics and cosmology more than ethics-centered kind of chapter or mini chapters.
Right. Well, do you have any final thoughts on this?
It did make me think a little bit about, I guess, the things we've already discussed, just the ego or the identity existing because of the divisibility that comes in linear time that would not exist otherwise. And it also made me think a little bit back to the concept of free will that we've touched on in the past, that perhaps on some level in the material world, our bodies, events in the material world, maybe to some degree or a total degree, I don't know. I don't really have a strong stance on it, deterministic, but at a higher realm, our apparently divided souls and consciousnesses are actually united and functioning on a level where perhaps they are, where they are able to have free will, because they're not bound by a series of events fixed that will occur.
Mm-hmm.
And between these two, there is that intermediate space that we as conscious people, the more we work on the self, ourself, and becoming more psychologically minded and self-aware and intelligent in various ways, both in our understanding of the world around us, of others, and of ourself, I think we're able to exert a little bit more free will than we would otherwise be able to exert, or at least be aware of. Not directly tied to this, but just kind of another example of how we exist in this in-between gray area between, as I guess, who was it who said it first? Was it Pico della Mirandola? I think so. Even though Nietzsche also said it, that we exist between the animal and the superhuman. I would venture to say that, we exist between the intelligible and the material, the divine and the mortal. And we're in a gray area in between.
Right. As human beings, we were given the spark of the divine according to the Stoics. So, I mean, while we have this life as a human being, we definitely have the potential to orient ourselves towards the divine and somehow get some sort of taste of it. Ideally, really, by the end of this life, really orient ourselves towards it fully. And then maybe the final outcome of that is being one of these souls that doesn't have to descend into the material world.
Right.
In which case you are basically one with the divine at that point.
Right. We're both divided and bound by time, but also whole and outside of time, according to what we just read, if we are those embodied souls.
Right. Good. Okay. Well, I think we can wrap it up here. Thank you, everybody. And then we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Right. Bye.